Along comes Christopher Dunn, and I've toured with Christopher Dunn. I've been in Egypt. I did his very last tour of Egypt ever. He said he wasn't going to do any more tours after this. I don't know if he changed his mind, but his very last tour was with me. And one of his early tours that led to the works in his book was with my mentor, John Anthony West. In fact, Christopher Dunn co-signed my book. If you look at the beginning of the book, he has...
The Adept Initiate's Guide to Luxor Temple, which we're going to talk about soon. What do you... Because we're kind of beating around the bush here of the pyramids and stuff. We talked a lot about the Sphinx, and we're talking about how they move some of these structures and stuff like that. You know, I always ask people this because there's all different theories. We were talking about some in the last episode as well, which you're more than welcome to bring up again if you'd like to, if it's relevant. But like, what do you think the pyramids are?
Pyramids.
But what purpose do they serve? Were they built to serve? You don't know.
We're told, or our general understanding is that the pyramids are tombs.
Right.
I personally don't think tomb is a good way to describe a pyramid.
Why not?
In the context of ancient Egypt. Because it's not exactly a tomb. And and what is a tomb? Who gets to define exactly what a tomb is? I would say that it has something more. I do believe that I don't think there's a human on this planet right now that can tell you exactly what there's plenty of alternative guys. There's Egyptologists will say, oh, we can, it's a tomb. And there's others that, alternative guys have all sort of ideas, Giza power plants, chemical plant, this, that, astronomical clock. And there could be components, to the geometries or proportions or being like because there is a solar event that takes place at Giza, right? You have the equinoxes and the solstice, and there's an alignment where the sun actually sets in between the two pyramids almost perfectly, and then it rises again. So we do know that there's a solar, they likely built this intentionally with the solar theme in mind. The pyramid itself, though, when we look at the pyramids, we're awestruck. The sheer scale, the ingenuity, the sophistication, the giant megalithic stones, the use of granite. It's absolutely amazing. What we know in Egyptology is that they say it was used as a tomb for the pharaoh, which is a very basic understanding. There's still a lot of room to develop that understanding, even in Egyptology. What do you mean by tomb? Does it mean that the pharaoh was interred there and laid to rest forever? When we look at the evolution of tombs in Egypt, go back to the earliest pre-dynastic civilizations like the Naqada, the Badarian, and the people we found around Nekkin. They were buried in usually in little holes in the ground that were dug out in fetal position, right? Like you're sleeping, all crouched up. That was the earliest burials. Then you have the whole, and Luke's probably talked about this if he talked about the evolution of history for Egypt. You have an evolution from the mastaba, which is in Arabic is like bench, and it was the burials. They'd build these burials, and then it takes place at Saqqara, where they start adding layers to it, and they flesh out the, what's supposed to be.
Yes, you went through all this.
Yeah, the pyramids, the Djoser step pyramid complex.
That was so cool to see that evolution.
Yep. And then it evolves over at Dashur. You have Snefru now. You've got the Red Pyramid, the Bent Pyramid, all before the Giza pyramids. They're not the oldest pyramids.
Right.
So by the time you're already in the 4th dynasty, there were pyramid buildings been going on, but it was the Giza pyramids are the apex of pyramid building. Nothing has paralleled that since those 4th dynasty, Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure. Everything seems to scale down a little bit. Things evolve and change. Security features change. But
and they're so goddamn big.
They're enormous.
I mean, you've stood in front of it a million times, but even the couple times I did,
climbed to the top of it.
It's like, what? You know what I mean?
And that's one of the reasons why people are like, oh, this can't be tombs. Why would you go out of your way to build a big, massive pile of rocks just to bury a body? Well, when we say tombs, are we talking about something that the pharaoh is going to be in? This is my point of evolution. It evolves even throughout Egyptian history because people now on the internet will be like, look at the Valley of the Kings. There are these long corridors with lots of hieroglyphs. Even in the 5th dynasty, the pyramid texts come into vogue. At the Pyramid of Unis at Saqqara is our first example of pyramid texts inside a pyramid, which is basically a series of spells to help guide you through the process of the afterlife. And so we know from this context that this pyramid, the Pyramid of Unis, which has a granite box for someone to be interred, it's talking about the afterlife. And then those texts, they weren't very pictorial back then. It was mostly just rows of texts of spells. Later in the New Kingdom, 1,000 years later, New Kingdom, ancient Egyptians, Valley of the Kings, This is over 1,000 years have elapsed. Now they're going into the ground, and there's an evolution takes place there. First, they're sinking shafts. Then they go in an angle. Then they go into the mountain itself. Then they start, adding hieroglyphs. There's a whole evolution of tombs. So a lot of people will point out and be like, well, the pyramids don't have any hieroglyphs. Tombs, like in the Valley of the Kings, they have hieroglyphs. You're talking about an aspect of a civilization 1,000 years later. They've evolved. The New Kingdom tombs are not Old Kingdom style burials. Why do I think it was in a sense a tomb? But not, I would say yes, it was used in, I think tomb is not a good word to describe a pyramid. I would say that I do lean toward the idea that it was used toward the process for the afterlife. Are you
saying it could be because you don't, like, it almost seems like it's a semantics argument, if I'm hearing this correctly, like, because you don't want to say definitively, oh, it was just a tomb, you're leaving the door creaked open that there was something else, not necessarily sinister, but something else useful there.
I wouldn't say sinister, but definitely the way I feel is that there is something more to the pyramids we don't understand, and Egyptian burials and the afterlife and that whole process and the function of the pyramid. Now, when we say it was how do we know with certainty that the pharaohs that were supposedly allegedly put in these sarcophagi, granite boxes, inside the pyramids were laid to rest there for all eternity? How do we know that it wasn't for a specific period of time? And it's something we're missing, that the ancient Egyptian ontology, their thought process was like, first there's a whole period for the mummification process. There's some 60, 70 days that it requires to go through this whole process for mummification. Who's to say they didn't have a process where they put the body inside, the stone for a specific period of time because their belief system was that somehow that fused with the afterlife, and then they, and then they move. I don't know. I can't say with certainty. It seems as though, because there are security features, the lids of the sarcophagi, the portcullis, which is like a trap door that prevents you from getting in, that they would seal shut. It does seem that they were trying to seal them. There's a pyramid, there's another pyramid at Saqqara where there's a unique sarcophagi or stone box inside. It's the only one of its kind that we found where it has this mechanism that allows like a trap door to shut down. And when they recently opened it up, when the Egyptologists opened it up, they had difficulty because it was like gypsum. So somebody sealed it shut, which means whatever's in there would probably still be in there because most of the other stuff has been looted. A lot of people will say they're not tombs because we've never found a body inside the pyramids.
Yes.
What you have to realize is that after the Old Kingdom, there was a period, an intermediate period, a period of instability, where things were in turmoil and there was upset and different people trying to fight for powers and struggle.
But they would steal everybody.
They would go in and steal. They would go in and it's likely people who already knew how to breach the system would go back in and steal whatever was there. All right. So,
but they would be able to steal every single body. You see what I'm saying? Like all these intricate, designs within the pyramid. You're saying they didn't miss one?
There's over 100 pyramids in Egypt.
Yeah.
People don't realize that. They think of Giza, they think of 3,
right.
And there was a few more. It's over 100. We've already, taken a look at all of them, and they've been excavated, they've been run through. For the most part, we can't. Well, there's actually later pyramids we have found bodies, so we do know. Like even in Luxor, on the west bank of Luxor is Deir el Medina, which is the workman's village. These were the artisans and masons who were crafting the Valley of the Kings for the pharaohs. It was secret knowledge. They had to go up around the back of the mountain. Likely they were blindfolded and brought to the Valley of the Kings where they would do the work. And it was a secret. Nobody was supposed to know this is where we were burying people. And then they would come back and they would use the same techniques in their village. In their village, in their settlement, is a pyramid. It's almost, it's inspired. It's like a Kushite pyramid, like a Nubian pyramid that you see closer to Sudan, a true pyramid, which is a shrine to a tomb. So we know that they were used as tombs. They were used in the afterlife process. People will say that because they're so big and so massive and no bodies have been found inside and there's no hieroglyphic inscriptions, we can't say with certainty they're tombs. So now we can make up all other theories about what they are. I'll say that, let's look at the context to begin with. You have the river Nile, all life. The Nile was the gift of Egypt. On the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, which are united to give us Egypt. Then there are two other lands, the East Bank and the West Bank. Yeah. East Bank of the Nile was about life. We talked about how in the last episode, how the sun would rise in the east. Correct. And then it would go to, there was no word for death. It would go to west. It'd go in the west.
Go to the underworld.
Yeah. So the way that Egypt is laid out, I don't know if you realize this, but the right side, The east bank of the Nile is all the houses of life, the temples, the mansions of the gods, the temples where gods are supposed to, Necheru, come down and inhabit the temple. That was life, houses of life. The mystery schools were called houses of life. West bank of the Nile, life, where the sun rises. Where the sun sets in the west, where I lived on the west bank of the Nile in Luxor. I was 5 minutes from the Valley of the Kings, Hatshepsut's temple. You go on the roof of my house. You could look across the river and see the Luxor temple. I was in the center of everything. I was a 5-minute walk to the giant colossi of Memnon. I was right there in the village with the people. And so on the west bank is death. It's where you go to die. It's where you put the necropolises in most cases. So Giza is a necropolis. There's evidence that it might have been an early settlement, but it was a necropolis. It's all burials. It's mastaba. Most of the Giza plateau, aside from the pyramids, are mastaba fields, right? So you have all these burials in a necropolis. You go up or you go along the Nile. You come to Saqqara, which is a necropolis where you have pyramids. You go all the way the whole west bank of the Nile. It's all these necropolises or burials, and then you have these pyramids in the center of a necropolis, which is associated with the afterlife. You don't put a chemical processing plant or,
why not?
Or in the middle of a cemetery. What cemetery do you know that has a Best Buy in the middle of it?
Yeah, I don't have that, but I'm saying, like, is there things don't have to make sense as we understand things to make sense in our life now. Human culture is weird. Right. It does change. So, like, what is, because you're getting towards, like, what that guy Landa Kem says, where he thinks, and I think, if I remember correctly, Christopher Dunn has a similar
Christopher
theory.
Dunn's a pioneer.
Right.
The short of all of that, you have, you have Max, well, the real pioneer would be Flinders Petrie. He was an early Egyptologist. Some of his methods are questionable now, but they still rely on him as a reliable source. He did a lot of measurements, did a lot of work in Egypt, and he noted a lot of unusual tool marks, which look like things that the Egyptians couldn't produce with what we have on record. Copper can't exactly grind in the chisel unless you have an abrasive, right? So Petrie was really the pioneer. And then in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, you have this whole movement, pyramid power. People are fascinated with the pyramids. You have this guy, Max Thoth. There was another guy. Max Thoth wrote the book, Pyramid Power. It was like a cult book. It was a big following. And he talks about the pyramids almost like it's an energy center power plant, but had no science to back it up. Along comes engineer. Well, I don't know if he's actually an engineer, but along comes Christopher Dunn. And I've toured with Christopher Dunn. I've been in Egypt. Right. I did his very last tour of Egypt ever. He said he wasn't going to do any more tours after this. I don't know if he changed his mind, but his very last tour was with me. And one of his early tours that led to the works in his book was with my mentor, John Anthony West. In fact, Christopher Dunn co-signed my book. If you look at the beginning of the book, he has...
The Adept Initiate's Guide to Luxor Temple,
yeah,
which we're going to talk about soon.
Right on the first page, he gives an endorsement. He mentions how he's toured with John Anthony West and me, and basically how, he had a great experience each time. Anyway, Christopher Dunn is kind of like the OG pioneer of bringing the science to lost ancient technologies. That's his narrative.
Got it.
Okay. It builds upon an older narrative, which Graham has taken ownership of, which is the lost civilization theory, which precedes Graham. I told you, you have even St. Yves Delvatre was talking about.
Graham is just the modern day guy.
Modern guy. So, and now you have all these new YouTubers, Uncharted X and Bright Insight and Brian Forrester, who have picked up on Chris Dunn's work.
Yes.
Right? In our whole space developed in this way on YouTube, right? Because previously everything was books and conferences. And then we have to really credit Brian Forrester. I don't see him as a trustworthy source when it comes to research. He gets a lot wrong. But we have to credit him with, it's just like Ancient Aliens. There's a lot of stuff I don't agree with on Ancient Aliens, but it does have a positive aspect, and it introduces people to a lot of these sites like Pumapunku that you might not have heard of otherwise. And Brian was a pioneer in the sense that he was the first bringing this stuff to the YouTube space. We got to credit him with that. People were watching Ancient Aliens. They wanted to know who these people were. They would look them up online, and then you would find Brian on YouTube. And he was basically doing Ancient Aliens in real life and leading tours. From that, And I was already at the same time traveling and researching, and I saw that and I said, oh, he's putting it on YouTube. Then more YouTubers started popping up, and then over time, Jimmy Bright Insight was inspired by Brian Forster. Right. He admits that. And so he's learning from a guy who learned from the Kemet School, learned from Chris Dunn. Chris Dunn put a book out on lost technology. 10 years later, Brian Forster, after going on a tour with Chris Dunn, puts a book out on lost technology. Chris Dunn would provide in-depth explanations. Brian Forster would take a few of his words, repeat it in camera. That's how his YouTube channel built up. And he became the lost technology guy. It's almost like Chris Dunn was forgotten in a sense on the internet, on YouTube. For many years, it was Brian. You want lost technology? It's Brian's channel. And then, now there's others that have picked up the torch in a sense and are doing a great job with that narrative. So yeah, that's kind of like a brief history of how this whole thing came in. And Christopher Dunn, he's gone around and looked at a lot of these tool marks. He's really the one that kind of brought about this whole idea of inheritance theory. The idea that the Egyptians, ancient Egyptians, dynastic Egyptians don't have the specific tools that he says are required to, leave these tool marks on record, on the archaeological record, and therefore it couldn't have been the Egyptians, which now opens up implications that it must be, you could say aliens, or you could say lost civilization. And we go further back in this whole alternative history. You got Von Daniken, right? Before Sitchin, you had Von Daniken in the 60s. Magicians, chariots of the gods.
Of the gods, yep.
What's it all about? All these ancient sacred sites, it's aliens. Along comes Graham in the 90s, flips one word, magicians of the gods. Yeah. Not aliens, humans in a higher state of consciousness, but not the dynastic Egyptians, lost civilization. And so this whole idea of inheritance theory, the idea that the Egyptians couldn't do it, I have a problem with this because number one, the Egyptologists, it's very rare that they conclude. I mean, there are conclusions, there's established texts, but often you'll find in their papers and academic journals, they're exploring. They don't always give a definitive answer. A lot of times you'll see they preface their words with likely or perhaps. Because they're trying to be careful because they know.
Well, yeah, that's fine. I'm cool with that.
Yeah, and then
they should do that.
We know that yes, copper can't directly impact granite to make some of these marks, but if you use the right abrasives, in tandem, and likely they were using their surroundings, natural surroundings. So I wouldn't say lost technology, more like lost technique, lost knowledge. And the alternatives will always say, well, the Egyptologists, that's not true. The Egyptologists literally say we have gaps in our knowledge.
Did you say on the last episode when this came up very quickly, did you say you had like a chemist go in or someone and assess from like that standpoint whether or not it could have been that and they found no evidence?
Specifically speaking to land of chems theory, I had a chemist and a metallurgist. When his theory first came out, quickly became popular. Johanna James was on one of my tours, and someone had came out to meet me on my tour, and he knew the land of chem guy, and he mentioned it to her. And she became interested, and immediately after the tour, she featured him and did a video. She has a huge YouTube following, so he got a lot of traction. And then shortly after, I think he was on the Danny Jones, and now
I've talked with him. Nice guy.
He's making some waves. So I've talked with him too. I didn't have the same experience. He doesn't like me. I've tried to cite references and show him stuff in Egyptology, and he doesn't want to be corrected. I was blocked on his YouTube channel, and he took to Instagram to attack me, and whatever. Point is, I don't care about the personalities. It's the actual argument, okay? What he's trying to say, and so Chris Dunn has the Giza power plant theory. And in between them, J.J. Hertek wrote a book, The Giza Industrial Complex. So it's similar theory. Then the land of chem comes and changes a little bit. Now it's a chemical processing, situation where they were using these to process certain chemicals. But
what chemicals?
You have to go through it. And it's been a while. And to be honest with you, I've stopped looking at the material because I reached a point where I'm just like, I'm wasting my time. Time is valuable. It's a fascinating theory. Sensationalism written all over it. It's perfect for podcasts. It's perfect for clickbait. But I pulled in a metallurgist and a chemist. I gave them the entire presentation. I went through everything with them. I have my Egyptological perspective because I could see certain things he was saying demonstrates a lack of Egyptology. And when I talked to these guys, and I realized that if his education isn't all the way there on Egyptology, I'd have to question his, education in chemistry as well. I'm not a chemist. I can't speak to that. I did pull in a chemist, metallurgist. They went through everything. Both of them agree that these claims are baseless.
Based on what? Like, what did they find?
Man, we would have to do a whole entire, to go back into, I couldn't articulate it well enough now. This is over a year. This is going back like a year or two.
Do you have a video on this?
No, but I was maybe, it's not on the top of my priority list. I would maybe make one addressing it, because I have all the notes. I have everything. I just need time to wrap my head around it and construct the argument.
Yeah,
I have like like on the John and James video in a comment section, I gave a bunch of points. I forget a lot of them now, but I gave a bunch of points on why his theory doesn't work.
Yeah, if you have that, you should do something public, whether it be a publication or some sort of video reviewing the evidence, just so it's out in the public square and we can play the game the right way, and he can have a chance to look at those points as well. I think, because again, I like to make peace in these scenarios. I want everyone's working on the same thing. Everyone wants to find out the truth, right? So everyone, if you play nice in the sandbox, everyone can be a part of that solution. It doesn't mean you have to be right about everything. But I think if you did actually take the time to have some quote-unquote experts come in there, a metallurgist and a chemist to break this down, like, the people should see that 100%.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And and I'm all on board with unity. And I'm cool with, coexisting with opposing opposites.
Right.
I've had people on my tours that I don't agree. I've co-led a tour with Christopher Dunn. We were great friends at the time. And, I didn't subscribe to his theory. I didn't wholeheartedly believe in it. And after the tour, I believed in it even less. When he took me on the Giza Plateau, and there's these boat pits, and he thinks that they were actually giant saw pits, that they weren't boat pits. And then when we went to, Egyptian Museum, there's a statue of Ramses, and he's telling me that he doesn't believe it's the statue itself is the product of the statue with its signature Nemes headdress isn't the product of the ancient Egyptian civilization, that they came along later and added their crude graffiti. There is usurping in Egyptology. The Egyptologists, this isn't nothing new. The Egyptologists know that the Egyptians were usurping earlier Egyptians. In fact, it happens quite frequently, even within the 18th dynasty. Horemheb comes along and crosses out Tut's name. Seti comes along and crosses out his name. And they're always usurping one another and adding their name during their time. This thing happens. But, when you have the stylistic features in the statue, you have the Nemes headdress of the pharaoh, which doesn't have a precedence before dynastic Egypt. And Chris Dunn's like, we'll prove it. We'll prove that it did it. The burden of proof is on you to show that it did. We don't have any evidence that existed.
Right.
So what he's trying to say is the statues were fashioned before the ancient Egyptian civilization, and then the Egyptians came along and just threw their hieroglyphs on top of it. And to me, it's sort of the same problem with the ancient aliens theory. You're taking accomplishment away from the higher consciousness of the human individuals that actually did this. Let's give the dynastic Egyptians their flowers. It's a big mistake, in my opinion, to undermine the intelligence and sophistication of the ancient Egyptians.
Well, and at the same time, though, and I would agree, because obviously along the way, there's incredible things that they did. People can argue over whether or not it was this thing or that thing, or this one had outside influence, whatever that was. But like overall, as a civilization, it's unbelievable, and I don't want to understate that, but like I think you make a good point in the sense that the argument of, well, you don't have enough proof, so therefore my thing that also doesn't have enough proof must be right, is literally pointing the finger from the glass house. It's like the Spider-Man meme where the Spider-Mans are like pointing at each other, and I feel like you're giving an example of it there with Chris looking at the establishment. I feel like we run into that in this field all the time.
Yeah. I try to be slow on the draw to say, I'm right and you're wrong, and also to have hardcore, as a practicing Rosicrucian, we practice tolerance, and we try to look at things through multiple lenses. We find that it's best to try not to conclude. Some things you can conclude on, and you can always align yourself with universal principles because they will never fail you. Everything else we have to, operate with the understanding that we're operating with our own limited understanding. And if you say that to most people, they'll be offended. Well, you're operating with your own limited understanding. You'll feel like I'm being condescending. That's the objective truth. We don't all know everything. But that's why it's important. Let's put our evidence out for our narrative. Chris is saying that, there's no evidence to prove those statues predate the ancient Egyptians. He's trying to say because there's tool marks that we can't, definitively prove it the ancient Egyptian. But when you look at the preponderance of evidence, there's a lot of nuances. And when you look at the statues, we don't find the stylistic features or statues that size anywhere before in Egypt in the dynastic Egyptian civilization. Not only that, for me, the big one was the boat pits. Christopher Dunn believes there was a giant semicircular saw. A boat pit, if you go to Giza Plateau, they have boat pits. They didn't find any, but this is always the case, right? You have tombs, you didn't find any pharaohs, so they can't be tombs. You have boat pits, we didn't find any boats, so they can't be boat pits. You go to the Serapeum, the Apis bull burial boxes, didn't find any bulls, so they can't be bulls. But that's bullshit, because we actually did find a boat in one boat pit at Giza, the Khufu solar boat. But in the interest of fairness, that pit is stylistically different from the others. But those stylistic features, and I've had boatmen come on my trips, yachtsmen, they're like, this has all the whole, one of them was on the trip with Chris Dunn. Some people came for the esoteric stuff, some people came for the lost technology. Chris gave his presentation on why he thinks what Egyptologists are saying on boat pits is actually for a giant circular saw that would have cut the stones for the Great Pyramids on demand. The way he explains it is that, the foreman, because all the stones are not perfect. They're not all perfectly precise and shaped. When you look at the core masonry of the pyramids, it's all kind of erratic. And so you would need a specific shape to fit on spec. So he's saying they would have the saw there on site and they would be able to cut it down on spec and deliver it to the pyramids, which, if we subscribe to the conventional chronology of ancient Egypt, 4th dynasty. These boat pits are 5th dynasty. They have all the signature hallmarks. So these boat pits didn't even come until after the 4th dynasty. And they have all the features that one would need for a boat pit. And we actually did find boats. Not at Giza, but we found boats in a boat pit at Saqqara. We found them next to Abydos. Few people know about. You got to dig deep in the archaeological record to find this stuff. So I told Chris, I believe there are boat pits. All the science studying this stuff, knowing that they look like 5th dynasty boat pits to me, I don't see how it would be a giant semicircular saw. And then there's a lot of other issues with it. It's not that simple. There's a lot of nuances to it.
Yeah.
But,
Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.